Horsemen of Revelation chapter 6. So these four horsemen coincide with the first four seals. And many times people paint these four horsemen as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That's not how the Bible shows them. The thing about the seven seals is that they also coincide with the seven churches and the seven trumpets. The churches, the seals, and the trumpets all cover the same time periods of history for the past 2,000 years. They just cover them from different perspectives. For example, the churches, the religious history; the trumpets, the more of the military history; and the seals, more of like the church missionary kind of history. Now in Bible prophecy, we have to look at what the different symbols mean. Now a horse in Bible prophecy typically represents strength and power in battle. Some verses for this, such as Exodus 15:21, Isaiah 43:17, and Jeremiah 8 verse 6. Now the color white typically represents righteousness, such as found in Revelation 12 verse 9 and 20 verse 2. Crowns typically represent kingdoms, victory, things like that. 1 Chronicles 20 verse 2, 2 Kings 11:12, Ezekiel 21:26 and 27, and others. Now, these seven churches, they cover history from a religious perspective. The Church of Ephesus covered about the 1st century of church history. So this first seal and the first horse are going to cover the same history. Not sure how well you can read this because it's kind of small, but this is from Amazing Discoveries, the ministry with Walter Veith, and you can see the churches over here on the left and the time periods right here on the right. So during the 1st century, the church was a pure godly church. They made such spiritual victories that was incredible. Thousands of people being converted on a daily basis. It was pure. Nobody thought of self. No true Christian was selfish. They went forth conquering and to conquer, it says. The gospel went forth because of persecution. They were all hanging out in one central area, and God allowed persecution to happen partly to get them dispersed to share the gospel to as many people as possible. And that's what this first horse represents. But then the Bible switches symbols in the second seal to a red horse. And it specifically says that there was power given to him to take peace from the earth, that they should kill one another, and there was given him a great sword. After about the 1st century, the church began compromising. I've heard it said that after about 7 generations of an organization, the members of that organization begin to lose touch with the reasons why it was founded. And keep in mind, during this time of Christian history, they were being massively persecuted. And so many began compromising. In fact, red in the Bible is used as a symbol of sin and compromise. So this church began being a compromising church as symbolized by the red horse. Now this time period went from about the year 100 to just past 300, maybe 323. And during this time, the Pax Romana had basically worn off. This was the time of relative peace over the empire. But during this time period, the Roman government really began amping up persecution against the Christian church. One of the reasons for this was because the Christians refused to worship the empire, or the emperor, rather. In fact, in the letter to the Smyrna church, it prophesied this persecution would be amped up, and Diocletian was the one who did that. And so this peace was gone. Just as this seal said, this peace would be taken from the earth. There would be major infighting within the empire, and just a lot of war and persecution. And war and persecution directed against the church, it's not comfortable, so they began compromising, and they became red in color. And then we get to the third seal, or the black horse. Now, since the church's seals and trumpets correspond with each other, the black horse, that one corresponds with Pergamus, the third letter to the 7 churches. And this went from around 323 AD to 538 AD. Now, during this church, the compromise within the church really amped up even more so. Their reproofs included things like the tolerance of the Nicolaitans, that is the doctrine that the law of God doesn't matter. And they were tolerating that demonic doctrine, right? There was idolatry, there was immorality as a result of the acceptance or tolerance of the Nicolaitan doctrine. So pause to read this seal. And then it says these foods would be sold for money. Now, taken literally, that's no big deal, but taken prophetically, this is huge. Wheat and barley were the ingredients used to make bread and oil. Wine is a symbol of doctrine in the Bible, either of true doctrine or false doctrine. Pure unfermented wine is true doctrine. Fermented wine is false doctrine. Oil is also a symbol of the Holy Spirit. Now I'm going kind of faster because I'm trying to keep it within the 10-minute time frame for TikTok. So go to Amazing Discoveries or Google Amazing Discoveries prophecy symbols chart. And all of the things that I'm saying, you'll see all the scripture supporting those symbols. So during this time, we see the prophecy that Paul mentioned where there was a kind of a blockage limiting the rise of the Antichrist during this time. But that was beginning to be removed. Now, bread in the Bible is a symbol of the Bible. And as we talked about what these other symbols mean, what began to be happening during this time frame and really amped up during the period of the Dark Ages, which we'll get to, is that the church began making merchandise of the gospel. Black is also a symbol of apostasy. Now, the church was not in full-on apostasy during this time period. This is Pergamos. The next one is Thyatira, which we'll talk about in just a second. But again, black in the Bible is symbolic of apostasy, compromise, corruption, immorality. And what we see when we study history is that during this time, the papacy was on the rise. It was not in complete control of Europe yet, but it was getting there. Whatever social media site you're watching this on, watch my playlist on the Antichrist to see why the Vatican is the Antichrist. But at this time, they were not yet in full control of Europe. But the closer they got to the Dark Ages starting, which was 538 AD, the more in control they became, and the more these things began to happen. The merchandising of the gospel. They even came up with false doctrines such as purgatory to get more money for the gospel, or indulgences. And these were for the purpose of fundraising, because they wanted money. Not because these doctrines were true, because purgatory, indulgences, those are very false doctrines. And then we get to the fourth seal in the pale horse. Now this seal also lines up with the historical time period of the church of Thyatira. That is the fourth letter to the seven churches. Now this time period went from about 538 AD to 1798. Now the reproof for Thyatira was their tolerance of Jezebel. Again, a woman in Bible prophecy represents a church, and a name represents character. So this is not just any woman they're tolerating the character of Jezebel, an extremely idolatrous woman of ancient times. So the church began being very idolatrous. They brought in pagan customs, pagan worship. They brought in the worship of Jupiter and simply called it the adoration of Peter, for example, right? And so this is where the church reached full apostasy. Now this was the official church of the land. There were pockets of true believers such as the Waldenses, but the official church reached full apostasy. Now this horse was a pale horse. His rider's name was Death, and hell followed him. And power was given over the fourth part of the earth to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and with the beasts. And the focus of this seal seems to be the major persecution conducted by the church, the official state church, against the true believers, such as the Waldenses, Luther, Zwingli, and others. And this happened because the church united with state. The priests of the church, the leaders of the church, the papacy, they wanted money, they wanted power. They didn't care about purity or righteousness. They wanted wealth and fame. They wanted the right to be able to control your conscience. And since the church doesn't have its own military, they united with the various governments of medieval Europe. And that is how they began forcing the conscience of millions of people. Various governments of Western Europe, such as Germany, France, England, were used to persecute and martyr the true believers. And when that happens, this is the sure result. Church and state should never be united. They should remain separate always. This was such a time of moral and spiritual declension that many people didn't know Jesus. They weren't even allowed to read the Bible. In fact, during the time period of the medieval years, the Dark Ages, if you were caught with a Bible, you could face the death penalty. In fact, it is estimated that in the Dark Ages, between those 1260 years, the Bible actually prophesied that time exactly, the Roman Catholic papacy was responsible for the deaths of 50 to 150 million people, martyrs. Anybody who disagreed with them was put to death if they could catch them. But even during this time, we saw God protecting his people. He never let them be martyred unless it was going to result in the salvation of others. In fact, some of the most powerful reformers became Christians because they saw true believers being martyred, but they were singing as they went to their deaths. In fact, when the Spanish Armada was sent to attack England for translating the Bible, they came into a storm and was destroyed. Now, I actually wrote a short book on this topic, the seven churches, seals, and trumpets. You can find it on iBooks. Search my name and title.